I want to invite you to open to Exodus chapter 21, verses 12 to chapter 23, verse 19. Go ahead and blow out the dust from that section of your Bible because you probably aren't in here a lot. We do expository preaching here at RCC, which means we go verse by verse through books of the Bible. And this is the section of the Bible where we tend to get tested. Do we really love all of God's word? And we're going to really go through all of it. And the answer is yes. And specifically, this section is case laws for Israel, God's people after the Exodus. What God is setting up a new kingdom, and he's giving them rules or laws to determine how they are to live with one another. And we get to talk this morning about a number of exciting topics, like do not cook a goat in its mother's milk, which I'm sure you were really hoping I would mention this morning and address for you. We also get to talk about what to do with roadkill, and a number of other hot topics such as capital punishment, human trafficking, caring for the poor, orphans, property rights, and all kinds of other stuff. It's all in one sermon this morning. And this section of scripture is typically where your yearly Bible reading plan meets its untimely death. This is, you start out great in January. I'm going to read through the whole Bible this year. And then you reach Exodus 21, 22, 23, and you're like, I'll skip today. And then you find yourself lost. Well, we're not going to skip it. We believe God's word is profitable and useful for all matters that it teaches, and so we're diving in. And we may read these laws and think they're very outdated. As you scan chapter 21, 22, and 23, what does this have to do with me? And that's not unlike many of the laws we have here in the United States. In the state of Arizona, it's actually illegal for a donkey to sleep in a bathtub. I would love to hear the story of how that law got started. In Connecticut, it's illegal for a pickle not to be able to bounce. They're serious about their pickles in Connecticut. In Delaware, it's illegal to sell dog hair. In New York, it's illegal to wear slippers outside after 10 p.m., which I think we can agree with that. And in our great state of Maryland, did you know it's illegal to wear sleeveless shirts at a public park? You look it up. It's illegal in Maryland to wear sleeveless shirts at the public park. So, men, you got to put the gun show away when you're at the park. We had a cop in the first service, and he yelled out, "That's right!" I'm sure they talk about this in the police force all the time. Well, these laws, as outdated and weird as they might seem, they make for a good laugh. But we tend to dismiss them, right? Because they seem entirely irrelevant to us. You think this has nothing to do with me, who cares? Well, unfortunately, I think when we reach Exodus 21 to 23, we tend to have the same attitude. Now, it's true that these laws were not written for us. They're for a specific people at a specific time at a specific moment in redemptive history. But these laws do have something valuable for us. First of all, they teach us the heart of God. They teach us that God has a heart for the needy. He has a heart for justice. He has a heart for equity and equality. He has a heart that he wants to make this world a safe and better place. And his kingdom is righteous and full of mercy. The laws of God reveal the priorities of God. And so if you're here this morning and you're not a Christian, this is a very interesting first week for you. I'm glad you came, though, because you get to get an inside look between Christians about what God expects from us. And I bet you there'll be moments in this sermon, and as you read this text, where you're like, I knew Christians were supposed to do this. It just hasn't been my experience. And you get to hold us accountable. And for the Christian in the room, these laws are actually comforting. In fact, our director of Gather Worship, Eric McAllister, he read through these laws last week, and he told me, and I'm so comforted by all these laws because it shows me that God is not cold and distant from the complexities of life in a fallen world. That God wisely and lovingly anticipates the ways that sin and violence and death will touch every corner of creation, and so he sets up protections for his people because he cares about every detail of our lives. So be comforted in the over 50 case laws in this text. And because there's over 50, we're going to have to sprint. If you notice, I'm at like 1.5 on the podcast speed. I'm going to keep it up because I want you to be able to go home and watch the Masters or enjoy this beautiful weather. All right. Last week, this is part 2. So last week, we saw laws about worship and laws about servants in chapter 20 and the beginning of 21. That was part 1. Part 2, we're diving into the rest of the case laws. We're going to finish them today. And we start with laws that God sets up in his kingdom about his people's behavior. And this section that we jump right into is actually often debated. And I would encourage you to talk about it, maybe even debate it in your gospel communities this week. And the first law of behavior is about intentional and unintentional homicide, murder and manslaughter. Verse 12, God says through Moses, whoever strikes a man so that he dies shall be put to death. But if he did not lie in wait for him, but God let him fall into his hand, then I will appoint for you a place to which he may flee. But if a man willfully attacks another to kill him by cunning, you shall take him from my altar that he may die. So we see three situations right away here. The first and the third situation are about intentional homicide. You notice the text mentions the use of cunning. It's a premeditated attack that kills somebody. You get capital punishment. The middle, however, is if you did not lie in wait for somebody, but you still killed them. Maybe you had too many margaritas and you drove your wagon over somebody and accidentally killed them. I'm sure that's what happened in Israel. I hope not. That was different, though. You didn't get the capital punishment. You were put in what Numbers describes as a city of refuge. You were banished. And this was also to protect you so that the vengeful family members did not kill you for killing their family member. Now, this setup for murder and manslaughter and these distinctions was completely different than the rest of the surrounding nations around Israel because they would never consider motive or intent. So if you accidentally or non-accidentally ended someone's life, you were still given death. But God in his kingdom says there's a difference. He sets up parameters here. Now, I know many of you will read this and have issues with capital punishment, but we must never forget the reason God is setting up the death penalty. It's because he values human life above all things. You see, the death penalty was used not out of indifference for human life, but because each human life is of tremendous value. A life for a life here does not express vengefulness, but rather the idea that the only payment that can be made for taking a human life is a human life itself. It's also important to note that God establishes this principle of capital punishment before these laws in Exodus. In Genesis 9:6, God says, whoever sheds the blood of a man, by man shall his blood be shed. For this reason, for God made man in his own image. So, this is referencing the Imago Dei, the image of God on each person. And so whatever it is that you believe about the death penalty, and you're free to have your own opinion, at least believe the principle behind it that people matter to God. They bear his image. What does that mean practically? Well, my friend Sean, I heard him say yesterday that if you take a rookie baseball card, really it's not valuable at all. It's just cardboard and ink, right? But if you stamp the image of Babe Ruth on this rookie baseball card, suddenly this cardboard and ink is worth $7 million. And in the same way, your body is just dirt and water mixed together. But what makes each of us, whatever our skin color, ethnicity, socioeconomic class, education level, where we're from, what we do, what makes each of us equally valuable before God is that you have God's image printed on you and God's breath in you. So each human life is of infinite value. And this principle of the Imago Dei, every human being infinitely valuable, distinguished God's people from the rest of the nations of the earth. Because in other nations, if you stole something, then you got the death penalty. If you broke and entered, death penalty. If you looted, death penalty. And God does not set up the death penalty for these types of crimes. You see, in many of the surrounding cultures, crimes related to possessions were more serious offenses than crimes against humanity. And these laws are set up to say one really clear thing. There is nothing in creation more valuable than human life. In fact, in the Code of Hammurabi, which is a common moral code of this period of time, if someone committed murder, they actually pay restitution by paying a fine. And this was rampant in that day. And what this set up was a society where the rich got away with injustice. They literally got away with murder. They could pay their way out, but not in God's kingdom. And there were protections here given, though, to protect the innocent. So you weren't unjustly killed for a crime you didn't do. That's why God says later in Exodus 23, do not kill the innocent. And that's why he says in Exodus 17, there needs to be at least more than one witness to prove that they actually committed this crime of murdering somebody. So it was a very serious penalty, but it was administered justly. Now, what does this mean for us? You could argue today that I agree with the principle, but I don't like the process in a fallen world. especially considering that capital punishment of the death penalty, the entire process in America has often been proven to be racially unjust. Yeah, in fact, a study in Washington State, Beckett and Evans in 2016 found that Black defendants are more than 4 times more likely to be sentenced to death than similarly situated non-Black defendants. You're 4 times more likely to get capital punishment if you're Black. In Louisiana, the odds of a death sentence were 97% higher if your victim was white. But if your victim was Black, you likely were not going to get capital punishment. These studies and many more, in fact, the University of Maryland released one in 2013 that's heartbreaking and very compelling, prove to us that the criminal justice, specifically the capital punishment system, is unjust in our society. So I do think there are times when Christians should oppose the death penalty, not because they disagree with the principle of the Imago Dei, but because of the unjust process, which has proven to be broken. Wherever you stand on this issue, what we should not oppose is severe punishment for those who dishonor the image of God in every human being. We are to be a people who value human life and seek the flourishing of all human beings. Now, the next law moves from murder and manslaughter to assault on parents and kidnapping. Verses 15 to 17, it says, "Whoever strikes his father or his mother shall be put to death." Yeesh. Now, I mentioned this last week. Again, you should listen to last week if you haven't. This will give you some context. These laws are not for us to wholesale adopt into our culture. This is for this time period in this moment in redemptive history, for this theocracy. But I do want you to see God's heart that you honor your father and mother. It says, whoever strikes his father. Now, in the Old Testament, this more so means a beat down, like throwing your parents into the octagon and beating them to a pulp. Beating them to the brink of death. That's what this is saying. If you beat your parents to the brink of death, I'll do the same to you, except I'll finish the job. Verse 17 moves to the same idea and says, whoever curses his father or his mother shall be put to death. Now, this is confusing. It doesn't mean like if you one time say, shut up, mom, you're going to get killed. In fact, my 4-year-old the other day, I didn't give him a second dessert, and he said, I'm going to scratch you. Oh my gosh. Take the lollipop, bro. I'm just trying to look out for your teeth, man. I think all of our kids, especially us as kids, have done something like that. We'd all be killed if that's what this is saying. That's not what this is talking about. Rather, this is the total rejection of your parents. This actually literally means a death threat. So this is more like a child who's older who looks at their parents and says, I wish you would die, or I want you to die right now so I can get my inheritance quicker. Kind of like the prodigal son in the Gospel of Luke. Or a child that grows up and their parents are dying and in need, and you neglect your family, and your parents are suffering in poverty while you're well off. God says to all these types of curses to your parents, that's shameful. The bottom line is if you speak against your parents, or worse, if you strike them, you're guilty of a great sin against God. You are to honor and care for them to the best of your ability. Moving on, in verse 16, God says, you cannot steal a man, which is actually a really encouraging verse. This is the application of the 8th commandment. Remember, this section is the application of the 10 commandments. And in the 8th commandment, God says, thou shalt not steal. Well, God applies the 8th commandment and says, thou shalt not steal human beings, which means don't be slaveholders. Don't human traffic. That's why Paul calls enslavers in 1 Timothy 1:10 ungodly sinners that are unholy and profane. So anyone who reads the Bible and says the Bible approves of slavery, well, obviously they haven't read this verse and they haven't read 1 Timothy 1:10 and they didn't listen to last week's sermon. Again, listen to that. All right. Now, keep in mind, all these laws are set against the backdrop of other secular nations. And in the Code of Hammurabi, which is the code of these other nations, which was established in about 1750 BC, the prohibition against kidnapping only applied to the upper class. So common people could be kidnapped without it being viewed as a crime. This happens all the time today in third world countries. But Israel was to be different. Just like every human being was given the dignity of rest through a Sabbath, every human being was given the dignity of being protected from being kidnapped, human trafficked, and enslaved. This is wildly countercultural in a slavery time period. Now, sadly, we know that this is even a worse problem today than it was then. Modern day slavery is the worst, the highest number of slaves in the history of the world today. It's actually the second largest, fastest growing international crime in the world, slavery. NPR just reported that there are about 50 million people enslaved today. Most people don't believe that when they hear it. In fact, it's grown by 10 million in the last 5 years. And more than a quarter of these 50 million slaves in our world today are children. The average age a child is kidnapped and used for sex trafficking is 12 years old. 12. And this text shows us we need to be people who rise up and defend the enslaved and helpless. There is a need, like there was in Israel, for God's people to be God's people and to come to the aid of the defenseless. And so there's some people in this room who are on law school or are lawyers. Use your career, use your vocation to fight for the defenseless. Some of you are medical professionals, go care for the defenseless. Some of you are in politics, go advocate for the needs of the slave. Some of you just want to lend a helping hand, go and help in any way you can. Pray for these folks. And let's see modern slavery end in our time. Why? Because we value the image of God and we care for everybody. This next section on behavior is on life-threatening injuries, chapter 21. God says, here's what happens if you get in a fight. So keep this in mind next time you're in Fells Point on a Saturday night, just helpful tips. Verse 18, when men quarrel, it says, notice, by the way, God is assuming men are going to quarrel. When you guys fight, he says, I just think that's hilarious. When one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and the man does not die but takes to his bed, verse 19, then if the man rises again and walks outdoors with his staff, he who struck him shall be clear. Only he shall pay for the loss of his time and shall have him thoroughly healed. Now, this makes total sense, right? The winner of the fight should pay the loser, pay for the loss of the loser's time where he wasn't able to work, pay for his medical bills. God is clearly setting up a system in Israel where fights are not worth what they're going to cost you. And there's a moral symmetry here, which is, that is, the punishment fits the crime all throughout this text. If you get in a fight, God says, don't kill the guy who started the fight. Make him pay for what he damaged. Cover the expenses. Cover the workers' comp until he's healed. Then he mentions a permanent injury, verse 20. When a man strikes a slave, male or female, with a rod and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. Now, again, we established this last week. This is not slavery as we think of it in 17th century Alabama. This is more like a temporary civil working contract where a family business hires an employee for 6 years and they're set free with a bunch of money, livestock, and even some wine. Again, last week we dove into this. This is going to be confusing if you don't have that context. But in this civil contract where this servant served under a master, there was no abuse allowed. God condemned masters from treating their servants violently. In fact, Leviticus 25, God says, you cannot rule over your servants ruthlessly. And if the master was ruthless with his servant, the servant would be avenged, the text says. Avenged means that the master would be tried as a murderer for killing his servant. I want you to think about how advanced this is for a 13th century BC desert nation. They're actually viewing slave servants as human beings. If the master kills a slave, he's on trial for murder. That wouldn't happen anywhere else in the world at this time. Why? Because each human being has value. Each human being is worthy of laws to protect them. Verse 21, but if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be avenged, for the slave is his money. This is a confusing verse at first until you get to verses 26 and 27 of the same chapter. God clarifies, he says, when a man strikes the eye of his slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let the slave go free because of his eye. If he knocks out the tooth of his slave, male or female, he shall let the slave go free because of his tooth. So if you hit your slave, you hurt them, you lose them, which would have been a huge financial loss of this time period. This would be like if somebody, your boss punched you, you lost a tooth, and you got $200,000 from the company. It's basically the ancient form of a civil suit. Now, obviously, being punched or losing your eye is not good for you. It stinks, but you're immediately financially compensated. So basically, God is setting up a system where he says, if you are a boss or a master, why in the world would you abuse your slave? Because it's going to cost you thousands and thousands of dollars, and it's not going to be worth it. And that's why God says in the text here, he is not to be avenged, for the slave is his money, because the idea here is the recompense is the equivalent of a financial ruin for the master. Again, what actually looks bad on the surface really is God protecting the vulnerable in an ancient agrarian society, a civilization hundreds and thousands of years ago. I actually find myself, as I zoom into this text, encouraged by it. And if you are confused when you come to text like this, I want to invite you to pause, seek some help, and you'll find that this is actually doing on the surface, in depth, the opposite of what you think it is, protecting the vulnerable. All right, let's move to permanent injuries. If you have questions about that, come talk to me after the service. Verse 22. When men strive together and hit a pregnant woman, this is again a confusing verse, so that her children come out, but there is no harm, the one who hit her shall surely be fined, as the woman's husband shall impose on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. Verse 23, but if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. So this is what's being described here. Two men get in a fight. I'm telling you, there are a ton of fights in Israel. I don't know what is going on. And a pregnant woman who is an innocent bystander watching, as these two men fight, she's watching and she accidentally gets hit by their fight. And if she's hit, there has to be a means of restitution and punishment for the crime done against her. Now, if no one is killed, then there's a fine imposed. But if a life is taken, and I want you to notice in this text that the fetus in that mother's womb is treated as a life. If there's a miscarriage because of that accident, there should be, verse 23, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Now, that might sound a bit barbaric, but this was actually an advance of justice in Near Eastern codes, because this took the penalty for crimes against humanity and made it, again, simpler than a harsh fine. Because with just a fine, like what happens in every society, the rich get off easy. A $10,000 fine might be a lot for you and I, but for somebody who's wealthy, it's just a scratch. Doesn't really change much for me. So this standard of God's justice, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, equalizes the penalty of sin for both the rich and the poor. You take a life, then you lose your life. You take an eye, you lose your eye. You take a limb, you lose your limb, rich or poor. These laws are known as the law of Talion, and they did not allow the rich to buy their way out of justice, showing again the equality and equity in God's kingdom. So in ancient Israel, O.J. Simpson can't get Johnny Cochran to bail him out. And Morgan Wallen, who threw a deck chair 6 stories down and almost killed a cop, he would get treated as everyone else would get treated in Israel. This is a kingdom of equity. Now, it's important to note this penalty, or this law of Talion, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, was not always applied literally. In fact, in verses 18 and 19, we see that if a man is wounded in a fight, doesn't mean he gets wounded in the same way he wounded someone else. It says, fine him. So this is not always applied literally, but it was a general idea that was applied to the justice system in Israel. It's left to the judges on how they would determine these things. And sometimes the punishment would be banishment or loss of property or a combination of other things like this. Now, what's interesting is Jesus actually brings up this text as a foundational piece of his Sermon on the Mount, the greatest sermon ever preached in the New Testament. He says, building on Exodus, he says, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for the tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil, but if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And what Jesus is saying is, this principle, eye for an eye, was never intended as a rule for our ordinary relationships. It was meant as a governing principle for a theocracy. It was meant to guide judges in assessing damages. Because, as Gandhi said, an eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind. If we always wronged each other the way we were wronged, then there'd be no one left. And so Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount says we should seek to imitate God's own generosity and mercy in our relationships. Because when Jesus was mocked on the cross, he prayed, Father, forgive them. He didn't cry out, Father, crucify them. He said, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they do. And that is how we as Christians are respond. In fact, 1 Peter 2 says, when he was reviled, Jesus did not revile in return. Paul says, be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another as God in Christ forgave you. Now, there are certainly times for us to appeal to the authorities for just consequences, but we who have experienced mercy should extend mercy. And even be willing to suffer to show mercy to the people around us. That's the law of Jesus in the New Testament. And I just want to say, as we apply this section, so much of conflict that I've found, especially in the church today, is because we're living in the old covenant and not transitioning into Jesus' new law and the new covenant. Because when we get in conflict, what you and I tend to do is we come to the people that we believe have wronged us and yell, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. They need to pay. They need to confess. They're wrong. Punish them. We tend to measure our sins with a ruler and other people's sins with a measuring stick, a tape measure. But so much division would be stomped out in the church if we followed Jesus' teaching and reversed this. When there is conflict, the first thing you and I should say is, I was wrong, and here's how. We should be asking questions like, how can I make this right? And we should, in the same way, be quick to extend forgiveness, because the only reason I'm even here right now is because Jesus forgave me when I wronged him. Thank goodness an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth wasn't the reality when God looked at me and my wrongs. And why is it when we step into relational conflict with the people around us, we are so quick to forget the very essence of our faith, that I am a helpless sinner who cannot save himself, and here's loads of evidence to prove it, and I need grace. But then we come into conflict and say, I'm the right one, you're the wrong one. That is the opposite of the gospel. This is why Jesus later said, judge not lest you be judged, meaning the grace you give is indicative of the grace you think you've received. The measurement of the depth of your understanding of the gospel of Jesus Christ, hear me, the depth of your spiritual maturity is displayed in the manner in which you extend grace to the people who've wronged you. It's measured in the speed in which you first own your own faults before you come to the table with the statement declaring, here's all the things you did against me. The most immature Christians come into conflict guns blazing, ready to snatch out an eye for the eye that they had snatched out, or the tooth that they had plucked out. And the most mature Christians I know, when they get into a dispute, and let me just say, even the most mature Christians get into disputes. But when they do, the first thing they say is, would you pray for me? I need God's grace. How could I have done better? Would you please forgive me for this? Here's what I can own. I need grace. That's the way of Jesus. Going back to these case laws, Moses moves from laws on permanent injuries and moves to injuries from animals. Verse 28 to 31 says, when an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall be stoned and its flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox should not be liable. Again, you see here the value of human life. Verse 29, but if the ox has been accustomed to gore in the past, and its owner has been warned but has not been kept it in, and it kills a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner shall also be put to death. If a ransom is imposed on him, then he shall give for the redemption of his life whatever is imposed on him. If it gores a man's son or daughter, he shall be dealt with according to this same rule. So basically, this is kind of what happens today with dogs. If you have a history of your dog biting people and you're warned once, twice, and your dog still injures another human being, you get in trouble. You get convicted because of your negligence of the animal you're responsible for. And so in Israel, if you have a wild ox that has a history of goring or hurting people, then there's going to be serious consequences. There's going to be liability. There's going to be blood guilt on you if your ox kills somebody. In fact, you can be killed for the negligence of what you own. Verse 32 says, if the ox gores a slave, male or female, the owner shall give to their master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned or killed. So what happens is if the ox kills a slave, the blood guilt of the slave's death is put on the ox and thus on the owner of the ox. The ox is put to death and the owner is put to death. Verse 30, the verse before says that if a free man is killed by the ox, a ransom, you see that in the text, or redemption needs to be paid to the man's family for his unjust death. In verse 32, if a slave dies, the master, which is the slave's current family, gets a blood price for the loss of their servant. Now, what's interesting about this whole section is, notice that there's a blood price that is put on the guilty party, the neglectful owner. So the sinful person has blood guilt on them, and the price of it is 30 shekels of silver. Interestingly, that exact amount of money, 30 pieces of silver, shows up again in the New Testament somewhere. Do you know where it is? It's actually the same blood price Judas received to sell out Jesus. The Son of God was sold for the price of a slave gored by an ox. And Jesus let himself be sold for a price so that he could then pay for our price. And you notice the text actually foreshadows it in verse 30 because it points out that when guilt or sin happens, a price needs to be paid. And then God uses the words here, ransom and redemption. So in this text, if your sin hurt somebody, a price needs to be paid. And this is pointing to Jesus' blood on the cross that forever ransomed us and redeemed us from the blood price that lay on our heads for our sin. Jesus' blood and his blood alone settles the score or pays the price of our sins against God. And the good news of the gospel is that God doesn't just put you at spiritual neutrality and say, all right, now go do better next time. I'm giving you a second chance. No, Jesus pays your blood price and then hands you all of the riches of his righteousness and his obedience so you get credit for his perfect life. And now, like in this text, you and I stand redeemed, ransomed, and justified before God only because his blood paid the price that was on my head. His life brought us life. And this text points us to that. Those are laws about behavior. Now let's move to laws about restitution. Basically, this is what you do in Israel if you get ripped off. These are property laws. And what's interesting about this section is if you offend a person in God's kingdom, you don't go to jail because there was no jail. You can't really build a jail in a desert. What you have to do if you wrong someone is you have to go to them face to face and confess your wrong and then pay them back double for what you wronged them. That's the model of reconciliation in God's kingdom. The first example of this has to do with irresponsible action, chapter 21, verse 33. Verse 33 says, when a man opens a pit or when a man digs a pit and does not cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit shall make restoration. He shall give money to its owner, and the dead beast shall be his. Now, this is sort of the principle. When you're guilty of something with irresponsible action, like not covering a pit or not watching over your wild ox, restitution had to be made. And this continues. If you look at chapter 22, verse 1, the second has to do with theft. You notice if you look at verses 1 through 4, you see there's actually a distinction made when it comes to theft, similar to our modern laws when it comes to breaking and entering. If you break and enter at night, you actually, the owner could kill you to defend their family, use force, and they were not guilty if they did so. But if you broke and entered during the day, the penalty would be less, and you could not kill the person that was breaking and entering. It's interesting. It's protecting, in a sense, or giving grace to the offending party, but also protecting all the citizens of Israel. Notice, God is so detailed in these laws. He cares so much about even the nuances. Verses 5 through 6 involve cases of negligence that leads to the loss of someone's property. And these punishments, again, are very sensible. Basically, whatever you destroyed in the community, you had to pay back double to that person and meet that person face to face and admit that you wronged them. Verses 7 through 13 deal with destruction of property. This is because there's no banks in this day. You can't just take your stuff and put it in the bank. You had to give it to somebody, and if somebody didn't take care of your possessions, restitution had to be made. Verses 14 to 15 had to do with borrowed property, which is very relevant to us. So if you borrow something and you don't return it in the same quality that you first received it, then you had to make full restitution. So the application point here is some of you owe me for some of the books that you borrowed from me because I've seen the spaghetti sauce on the pages and the bent pages, and you're supposed to leave it the way you found it. Now, all these might seem really random and weird. How do we apply this to our daily life in the 21st century? This entire section is teaching us that if you harm your neighbor or if you harm your neighbor's property intentionally or even unintentionally, the onus is on the offending party to make it right. Not if the other person brings it up. It's on you to bring it up and to pay. So if you borrow something and break it, you pay for it and more. If you make a mess in someone's house, you are to clean it up and leave it better than you found it. If you use someone's car, fill up the gas tank and clean up the Cheerios off the seat. The way Jesus put it is, do unto others what you would want them to do to you. Christians are a people who leave stuff better than they found it. That's what this text is about. And it's actually God's mercy that makes us want to be a people of restitution. You know, everyone in the New Testament, after they became a Christian, they went back and paid full restitution for the people they had wronged. It was actually wee little Zacchaeus. You remember Zacchaeus in the New Testament, who was a thief stealing from people? But when Zacchaeus met Jesus, what was the first thing Zacchaeus wanted to do? Make things right. That's what you do when you become a Christian. You go and make things right with people. Zacchaeus said, if I took from anybody, I'll pay them back 4 times as much as I stole. The Old Testament law only demanded that you pay twice as much as what you stole, but Zacchaeus says, I'll double it, 4 times as much. And then he says, I'll give half of everything I have and give it to the poor because I was poor spiritually and Jesus gave to me out of his riches when I was in need. So in response, I want to go do like he did. Why does he do this? Because the gospel creates within us a heart to make things right with people. Because Jesus went the extra mile for me, because it wasn't his debts he was paying, but it was mine, because it wasn't my wrongs that he was paying restitution, his wrongs he was paying restitution for, but my wrongs he was paying restitution for, I want to do likewise and make sure I make right the things that I've wronged. Those are laws about restitution. Let's keep moving quickly. Laws about holiness, chapter 22, verse 16. This is the law and order SVU chapter of Exodus. These laws relate to premarital sex. I just got your attention. All right, everybody lock in. This is going to be interesting. This premarital sex is something so common in our day and age that people don't even think twice about it. In fact, I bet you there's people in this room practicing it who don't even think about it. Verse 16 says, if a man seduces a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall give the bride price for her and make her his wife. If the father utterly refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money equal to the bride price for virgins. Now, what on earth is this? Well, it's saying that if a man seduces a woman, he flexes his biceps, undoes a button, shows out the chest hair. Now, if he seduces, meaning this is pointing to consensual sex, not forced. But if he's seducing and manipulating a young woman, that makes him like Satan, who is a seducer. And if they sleep together, God says you can't just move on in life as if nothing has happened. Not in God's kingdom. If he takes this lady's purity, God says you owe the father a bride price. Now, what is a bride price? It's the price you would pay the father to take this woman as your wife. Now, scholars say this wasn't to purchase the woman. This was more so a sign to the father that you're going to take care of his little girl. And the idea here is you don't just go have sex with someone and move on with your life. If you take this purity from a young woman, basically what God is saying here is you have blatant disregard for her worth. And you see here that the man has the responsibility to provide for this lady through marrying her because sexual intercourse is the sign of the covenant of marriage. So they would get married, unless, the text says, it has a stipulation, unless the father refuses, which is allowable, verse 17. If the father looks at this guy who slept with his daughter and has to now marry her and says, this guy is an absolute bum. He's living in his mom's basement. He only plays Call of Duty. He has no job. I'm swiping left. We were not marrying this guy. Which I think is an interesting point, right? Like, I know a lot of Christians who got married too quickly because they wanted to have sex so badly. That's stupid. And I know a lot of Christians who've gotten married because they already had sex and felt like they had to get married. 2 dumb decisions is not better than 1 dumb decision. God says in here, in some cases, it's if you've slept with someone, it's not wise to marry them. But I do want you to see clearly the consequences for premarital sex are huge. And this shows us 2 things. It shows us first the value of a woman. You can't run around sleeping with anyone you want, because in God's eyes, if you sleep with someone, you're forever linked to them. If you unite yourself with one of God's daughters, you better commit to them. And that's why in this society, the entire family was involved in the marriage, to protect the woman from being used and abused. Much different in our day, isn't it? It also shows us the value of purity. We tend to live in a very over-sexualized culture, don't we? And we are so far removed from this type of society. It seems like something from another world, doesn't it? Do you know more money is spent on pornography today than on pro football, basketball, and baseball combined? More people have been exposed to pornography than ever before in history. And people think very little today about modesty and purity. Even if you scroll Facebook or Instagram, soft porn will just casually pop up. And what we see here is God is calling his people to holiness and honor and self-control. And I think it's so interesting because when people see that today, they're so mesmerized, so amazed by purity. There's this famous book called Pride and Prejudice that women love. Just you guys know. I mean, it's turned into a movie. I'm not reading the book, but I've seen glimpses of the movie, right? And there's a scene in that movie, Pride and Prejudice, that is mega viral all over Instagram and TikTok and everything. Because in this scene, there's this main guy, Mr. Darcy, which the girl's like, oh my gosh, Mr. Darcy. And there's this other main character, the woman in the book, Elizabeth. And in this scene, Mr. Darcy is greeting Elizabeth as she gets off her carriage, and he extends his hand to let her off the carriage, and she grabs his hand, and she walks down, and then they leave, right? And what the film does is it zooms in on Mr. Darcy's hand after he's had the honor of touching the hand of the woman he adores, and he just flexes his hand because he's so amazed he got to touch her hand. And the women are like, oh my gosh. I've seen so many reaction videos from women who are like, if I could just find a man like that. Girls go crazy over this scene. Like, Mr. Darcy's so self-controlled. He's so pure. Where can I find a Mr. Darcy? You should find him in a church. That's where you should find him. Right? Mic drop. And if a fictional character from the 1800s is the best model we can find of a good man, you know we're jacked up as a society. Like, this is our example? And I know this isn't everyone in this room, but I think a lot of us need to realize that the things that you're looking for in a partner, the things that are probably deal breakers in your mind right now as you desire to get married, like they need to go to the gym, or they need to be at least 6 feet tall if I want to marry them, or they need to make $100K a year at least, or they need a college degree, or I need to get along with their mother-in-law. They need to be able to juggle 5 balls over a tightrope with rivers of crocodiles. Like, they need to do everything. In fact, I saw a stat the other day that says many women say, I need a 6 foot tall man at least who makes $100K a year. Do you realize that that's less than 2% of the male population? Less than 2% of the male population is 6 foot tall and makes over $100K a year. So you're fighting for a very small pool here. And listen, the short kings need some love. Someone clapped. And my point is, we can be blinded by what the world values and be missing out on what God values that's right in our face. Sisters in the room who are single, I want to encourage you, look for a man who's loving Jesus' bride well, loving the church well, and he will love his bride well. If he's faithful with Jesus' bride, he'll be faithful with his. And men, I want to say the same thing to you. The kind of woman that you want to marry who's going to be a great mom to your kids and a good partner for life is more likely to be restocking the coffee on the first floor this morning than they are to be restocking the margarita on the rooftop pool bar. Make sure you value purity and meekness and kindness more than you do flash and sizzle, because one is substance and the other is show. In fact, did you know my wife, Sherry, I got her permission to say this, don't worry. But when I met her, she had never dated anyone else, ever. And I changed the game. But no joke, my wife had never kissed a guy. She probably never even hugged a guy. I don't know if she touched a guy ever. I'm just kidding. But she was so different from the world. So different. She wasn't on Tinder. She wasn't going to the frat parties. She was at Bible study and serving in the kids' ministry and studying in the library. That's all she did. And it just blows my mind that there was this incredible woman who was quietly serving when no one was watching. I mean, she was wearing capris in the year of our Lord 2013. Capris. She had no sense of style at the time. I got her permission, okay? She would agree. They might as well have been camouflage. But I'm telling you, though, behind that quiet, out-of-style veneer was this Proverbs 31 woman who has been the second greatest joy in my life aside from knowing Jesus. I'm so grateful I married that woman. And she was where not many other guys were looking. And so I want to encourage you, make sure you're looking for the right thing in the right places. That's why Paul in the New Testament says, flee from sexual immorality. He says, you have been bought with a price. You belong to God. You're God's. You're God's. Doubly by creation and redemption, if you're a Christian. You're not your own. So glorify God with your body, he says. He says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, each of you should know how to control his own body in holiness and honor. And last thing on this, men especially, this text is calling out men specifically. I was at a men's conference last weekend, and I mentioned that our worship team led actually, it was like a 500-person, 600-person men's conference. They did phenomenal. But one of my friends who was speaking, Sean, he said, he's going through Ephesians 5, and he said, one of the main reasons we should be avoiding premarital sex isn't because it breaks a rule, but the reason we should be avoiding premarital sex is because men, you have been charged according to Ephesians 5 to give the world a living picture of Jesus Christ. And when you sleep with somebody who's not your bride, you give the picture of a Jesus who is impure and unfaithful. And you have the high calling of showing the world the purity, the holiness, the honor of Jesus, displaying the gospel so that you can declare the gospel. Live up to your high calling. Honor God with your body. We need a revival of honor today, not just in 18th century books, but in the church. Now, continue on, the next section has more to do with death penalties. It mentions sorcery, bestiality, worshiping false gods. I'm going to skip over that. But all these sins brought the ultimate consequence, which was the death penalty. And this might seem harsh to you, but again, this is God being gracious. He's warning his people, protecting his people, saying to them, if you go down this road of bestiality and sorcery and idolatry, your entire society will die, and I'm giving you this serious punishment as a warning to come to me and follow me and know me so that you can have life. And when you lead people down this road of destruction, you kill them. Those are laws about holiness. Now, 6 of our 7 laws about social justice God mentions compassion for the sojourner, widow, and the fatherless. He speaks of the weakest members of society. Verse 21, he says, you should not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. Once again, the motivating factor for why Israel is showing justice and mercy was that they had been shown justice and mercy. He says, you know what it's like to be a refugee, so identify with the refugee. Care for them. Verse 22, you shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. Again, God is speaking about the widow and the fatherless. It's a passion area of his. And that's because there's this tendency in this broken world to abuse the defenseless. And God tells his people, you are to be different. You're not to take advantage of the defenseless. You're to take care of the defenseless, to pray for the defenseless, to welcome them as I have welcomed you. And he takes it so seriously. He says in verse 23, if you do mistreat the defenseless, the orphan, the widow, then they will cry out to me, and I will surely hear their cry. They have a direct line to me. And my wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless. Notice, this punishment doesn't come from the authorities in Israel. This comes directly from God himself. I will come down and punish you myself. If you hurt widows, I will make your wife a widow. If you hurt the fatherless, I will make your children fatherless. This is very serious. God is passionate about the widow and the orphan, and we should be too, because when we were widows, Christ became our groom. When we were fatherless, God adopted us into his family. When we were strangers outside of his grace, God welcomed us in as citizens to his kingdom. And those who have experienced this saving grace should be the very ones who are caring for those in these types of situations. Why? Because, think about this. Who are the people most passionate about protecting the homeless? People who have been impacted or experienced homelessness. Who are the people most passionate about protecting people from drunk driving? Like MADD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. It's the people who have been hurt by drunk drivers. And so this text is essentially saying, who are those most likely to care for the orphan and the widow? It's those who know that they used to be orphans and widows outside the kingdom until God rescued them. That's why, because we identify with them. And sadly, I think so many Christians are content to ignore the orphan and the widow because they don't see themselves as one who was poor. They don't see themselves as spiritually bankrupt or in need. At worst, many Christians think I'm middle class in spirit, not poor in spirit. I do some good, God does some good, and we get to heaven together. But one of the clearest displays that you understand the gospel is that you immediately identify with the destitute, the hopeless, because that's what I was when the blood price of my sin laid on my head. I was spiritually hopeless, in debt, dependent on outside help to come and rescue me. And that's what Jesus did. His riches saved me because when he was rich, he became poor for my sake. And God says, go do likewise with the orphan, the widow, the poor. He continues advocating for the poor. In verse 25, he says, if you lend to any of my people with you who is poor, you shall not be like a money lender to him, and you shall not exact interest from him. Now, we know from other parts in the Bible, God is not condemning letting people borrow money, but he is against exorbitant interest. These Israelites were charging like credit card rates, interest rates against their brothers and sisters, and God tells them, don't abuse the poor in this way. In verse 26, he says, if you ever take your neighbor's cloak in pledge, that would be like someone who is poor using their jacket as payment. You shall return the cloak to him before the sun goes down, for that is his only covering, and it is his cloak for his body. And what else shall he sleep? And if he cries to me, I will hear him, for I am compassionate. So here's the situation. You need a loan. You probably need some money for your basic needs, food, water, and you have to put up something for the money of that loan as collateral. And if you're really poor, the only thing you have as collateral is the shirt on your back. And God says, if somebody loans you the shirt off their back as collateral or for a loan, don't hold on to that shirt. He's got nothing to sleep with at night. Give it back to him. And in fact, this is what Jesus is referring in Luke chapter 6. He says, but I say to you, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. To the one who strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And for the one who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either. Give him yours. Give to everyone who begs from you. And from the one who takes away your goods, do not demand them back. And he gets down in the end, he says, even sinners love those who love them. You should be merciful because your Father is merciful. So Jesus takes this law and takes it even further. He says, if someone gives you their cloak as collateral for a loan, give them their cloak back. And in fact, let them keep the money and also give them your Patagonia jacket because they need it more than you need it right now. Why? Because you are displaying to them the same mercy you've received from your Father. And do this even with your enemies, he says, without expecting a return. That is the kind of people God wants us to be. Now, obviously, it can be argued there are times when it's probably more merciful to not support someone in a lifestyle that's damaging to them. Perhaps an alcoholic, drug addict, things like this. But there are times when it's good just to give a simple gift to somebody in need, especially in the family of God. And then he says, respect for God and leaders, verse 28. Chapter 22, you shall not revile God nor curse the ruler of your people. So obviously they can't curse God. We mentioned earlier they can't curse the parents. And here he says you can't curse the leaders who are in authority above you. Paul later affirms this in the New Testament and says, every leader in your life has been set up by God. And I just want you to think about that reality for a second. Your boss, your landlord, your professor, even your resident director at your dorm, all of those authorities have been set up by God to teach you something right now, to accomplish some redemptive purpose. And that's why Paul says, don't criticize your leaders, pray for your leaders. Because God's doing something in all this. He's teaching you something. And then he talks about giving offerings and consecration. He says, verse 29, you shall not delay to offer from the fullness of your harvest and from the outflow of your presses. Long story short, they would give 10% of whatever they received as payment in their paycheck, which they considered from God back to God, which is a simple pattern that we should also follow to give back to God what he's given to us. Verse 29, he says, the firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. This isn't literally like sacrificing your sons. This is more so consecrating or dedicating your children to God. And so this is a good question for fathers. If you've had kids, have you had a moment where you said, God, this child is your child before it's my child, and I consecrate him to you. I'm going to raise him up in your ways and dedicate him to you. That's what's happening here. He says, you shall do the same with your oxen, verse 30, and with your sheep. 7 days it shall be with its mother. On the 8th day you shall give it to me. You shall be consecrated to me. Therefore you shall not eat any flesh that is torn by beasts in the field. You shall throw it to the dogs. So long story short, don't eat roadkill, which I know we have counselors available if you need help with that. And the reason this law is set up because this is about ritual purity. God doesn't want anything unclean to defile them. But we know Jesus clarifies in the new covenant that it's not something dirty on the outside that makes us unclean, but our own sinful hearts within us that make us unclean. Jesus essentially says sin is more like a cancer growing within you than a germ caught outside of you. And we need a new heart, and Jesus gives that when we place faith in him. He says, do not pervert justice. You shall not spread a false report, chapter 23 says. That would include don't lie in court, don't input dishonest numbers in your office reports. This is important. Don't give dishonest reports in relationships. Don't spread gossip. Or this is something that Christians do all the time and it never gets corrected, but it causes dysfunction and chaos in the church all the time, is we impute motives to people's actions, assuming their sin, and give false reports about it. For example, I walked in the building today and Bob never said hi to me. He's so selfish. Well, you don't know the reason he didn't say hi to you is because he was selfish or because he's angry with you, but you've just judged his heart and then spread a false report to someone else about something that you have no certainty about. That is spreading a lie, spreading a false report, setting an uncertainty, and it causes dysfunction and divisiveness in the church. Do not impute motives to people's actions unless you know the action is inherently sinful. He says, you shall not join hands with a wicked man to be a malicious witness. He says, you shall not fall in with the many to do evil. Long story short, he's saying, choose your friends wisely. You are probably the average of your 5 closest friends. You're going to become more and more like them the more you spend time with them. So choose those 5 people wisely. Nor shall you bear witness in a lawsuit, siding with the many so as to pervert justice. Verse 3, nor shall you be partial to a poor man in his lawsuit. Which, now look at this. He says, don't be partial to a poor man in his lawsuit, verse 3. And then he flips over to verse 6. He says, you shall not pervert the justice due to your poor in his lawsuit. So God essentially says, don't be partial for the poor or the rich. Be impartial, be just to both. He says, don't take a bribe, verse 8, which is a common problem in many impoverished countries. Don't kill the innocent, verse 7. God is serious about justice. And then verses 4 through 5, he says, love your enemy. Pray for those who persecute you. Essentially, Jesus builds on this in the Gospels, Luke 6. So those are laws about worship, servants, behavior, restitution, holiness, social justice. And the last one is about Sabbath and festivals. I'm not going to read it because I ran out of time. But essentially, God wants his people gathered together, worshiping him, which is actually a great foreshadowing of church membership, which I mentioned at the welcome. The reason God sets these festivals up is he wants his people to be one, serving under him. And if you're not doing that, you need to do that. And then we reach our climactic conclusion, Exodus 23, verse 16, you shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk, the one you've been waiting for. What is this about? And what's interesting is it actually appears 2 other times in the Bible. Now, this could simply mean don't use that which is the source of life for death. Like, in a sense, don't mess with the created order. But it probably more so means don't participate in pagan rituals, which included this practice. The idea here is God wants his people separate from the rest of the world. When lost people come into this room, they should see these people are different. Not only do they not boil a goat in its mother's milk, but they're kind, they're welcoming, they're equitable, they're people of justice. They worship God and God alone. That's what this is getting at. Now, as we close, all of these laws point us to this one fact. You and I need a Savior, don't we? Not only can we not keep all of these laws, we can't even remember all of these laws. Could you imagine trying to memorize over 50 of these things? We were talking about when we started the 10 Commandments. I don't have the 10 Commandments memorized. Many of us don't. Could you imagine also memorizing all of these? If you take these laws as application of the 10 Commandments, we're left in the same situation we were when we went through the 10 Commandments, that we cannot keep God's law. Especially since Jesus comes and adds to it and says, don't just abstain from murder, abstain from hate. Don't just abstain from adultery, abstain from lust. Don't just give that person your cloak, give them your tunic as well. Don't just look out for your enemy's property, look out for your enemy too. We can't do it all. And the law cannot do anything but say to us, you're guilty and you need him. And the good news this morning is we have one who kept the law. Jesus Christ lived the life we could not live and died the death we should have died, keeping the law, all of this entirely until the cross, dying for those who have broken the law, and then giving us his Holy Spirit, empowering us to obey the law. And so hear me today. What we present to you, friend, is not the law. It's not the rules. It's not the do's and the don'ts. It's the gospel of the glory of God. We present to you Jesus Christ, who is our salvation. We are lawbreakers, and he is the law fulfiller. And this is why no one can steal our joy this morning. This is why we're celebrating this morning. This is why we're taking the Lord's Supper this morning, because though we have blood guilt on our heads for breaking God's laws, we stand righteous, credited with his obedience, because he did it when we couldn't. And so no matter what you're facing today, I want to encourage you to celebrate in this good news, especially as we transition and take the Lord's Supper. Let's remember God's grace, that as you take that cup and that body, the bread and the juice, what you're saying is, it's not my righteousness or my good deeds that saved me, it's his. And if without him, I'm done. And if you're here this morning, you're not a Christian, we ask that you would refrain from taking of the elements, because that isn't a reality of your life. You're still trying to swim your way across the Atlantic Ocean. You're still trying to prove yourself through your righteousness, and you're not righteous because you've broken these laws. And so we would say, don't take communion. Take something better than communion. Take Christ himself.